to his wife's office tower and saw his own name on a sign, and understood, in a breath, that he had already lost everything she thought she had taken from him. For 16 years, Marcus had been a devoted husband, a steady man, and the head of environmental consulting operations at a regional engineering firm in Columbus, Ohio. He had spent 12 of those years building a client list no one else on the floor had the patience to build. Site remediation contracts, state compliance work, brownfield development assessments across 4 counties. The kind of work that did not make headlines. The kind that kept buildings from poisoning the water table. He drove a 2015 Toyota Tacoma with 118,000 miles on it and a cracked rear bumper from a job site in Zanesville that he'd never bothered to fix. His colleagues called him the map, because whenever anything went wrong in the field, someone pointed toward Marcus. He had never once complained about not being pointed toward a window office. His wife, Danielle, had risen fast. She had been a communications director when they met. She was a regional VP when they married. She was, as of 14 months ago, the CEO of a mid-sized environmental services company called Verifeld Solutions, a company that competed, in quiet ways, with the firm where Marcus had spent his career. When she told him about the offer, he had cooked dinner and opened wine and held her face in his hands and told her she had earned every floor of that building. He meant it. He had always meant it. What he did not know on that night, or on any of the nights that followed, was that Danielle had been quietly funneling the architecture of his professional life into her own. Client relationships he had cultivated for a decade, site assessment frameworks he had written on his own time, a compliance methodology he had developed and never formally protected. She had been building Verifeld's service model around the intellectual infrastructure of his career, piece by piece, over 22 months. She had never asked. She had assumed, with the casual confidence of someone who had always moved upward, that what was his was also hers to use. She had no idea that Marcus had spent the last 9 weeks documenting every transfer, every appropriated document, every client name she should not have had, inside a legal folder that was already on the desk of an intellectual property attorney named Harrison Cole, and that Harrison Cole had already made 3 calls to the Ohio Attorney General's office. What she did not know, and what she could not have anticipated, was that the sign Marcus would see on the glass door of her building that morning was not her name. It was his. Before we get into the story, absolutely cannot miss. The alarm went off at 5:22 a.m. Marcus reached across the nightstand without opening his eyes, silenced it, and lay still for 30 seconds in the dark. This was his ritual. 30 seconds. Not sleeping, not planning, just present. He had read once that architects do this before they begin a design. They sit with the empty space. He had never told anyone that. It sounded like the kind of thing that would get him called sensitive by the men on his job sites, which would have been inaccurate anyway. He was not sensitive. He was thorough. He made coffee in the kitchen before Danielle was awake. Black, no sugar, poured into a stainless thermos he had owned for 6 years and replaced the seal on twice. The kitchen was the room in the house he understood best. The 12-inch gap between the refrigerator and the wall, where he had run the new electrical line himself. The cabinet hinges he had adjusted 3 times over the years, until they fell flush. The window above the sink that faced east and filled the room with morning light he had learned to work in. He stood at the counter and drank the first quarter of the thermos standing up, watching the light come in. He had been a morning man his entire adult life. He arrived at job sites before the crew, reviewed the day's parameters, walked the perimeter alone. He liked the silence before the work. He liked knowing the landscape before it was full of people who needed things from him. He had built a reputation the slow way, client by client, contract by contract, year by year. When he was 29, he had inherited a contaminated brownfield project in Chillicothe that 3 previous consultants had walked away from, and turned it into a case study that the firm still used in their new client presentations. He had done it by staying longer than anyone else, reading more than anyone else, and refusing, on principle, to tell a client something he wasn't certain of. You will only tell someone a thing is safe when you can prove it. That was his standard. He held it regardless of deadline pressure, regardless of what the client wanted to hear. His professional reputation was built on one sentence, repeated in different forms across 16 years of client relationships: "I will not sign off until I'm sure." Clients who needed speed hated him. Clients who needed accuracy called him first. He had a daughter, 6 years old, named Callie, who attended first grade at an elementary school 12 minutes from the house. He picked her up on Tuesdays and Thursdays. He made her lunches, turkey and cheddar on whole wheat with the crusts removed, a small bag of pretzels, a note in the front pocket of her bag that she could not yet read all the words of, but always opened first. He had started writing the notes when she was 4, before she could read at all. He wrote them in careful block letters. She kept them in a shoebox under her bed. Danielle had noticed the notes once, going through Callie's backpack for a school form. She had said, without looking up, "She can't even read those yet." Marcus had said, "She will." Danielle had moved on to the form. The exchange had taken 11 seconds, and he had not thought about it again for 2 years. He thought about it constantly now. He had noticed the change in Danielle gradually, then all at once. The way she answered his questions had shifted, shorter, with a faint impatience, as if the questions themselves were a minor inconvenience she was managing. She had started referring to her work in terms he did not recognize: client philosophies, engagement modeling, service architecture, language that had not been in her vocabulary 3 years ago, but had become, almost overnight, the dominant grammar of her professional life. He had listened with interest. She had never asked for his. She came home later. The dinners he made sat in the oven on warm more frequently. She traveled more: Denver, Atlanta, Pittsburgh. Clients she described in general terms and never named. No stories, no particular tiredness that came from the specific labor of a specific place. She came back smooth and professional and slightly absent, as if she had not so much returned as resumed. He told himself she was growing into the role. He told himself that the distance that had entered the house was the cost of her ambition, and that he had known, when he married her, that she was a person who moved toward things faster than most people did. He believed in her. He had always believed in her. He stopped believing on a Sunday afternoon in March, when he went into the home office to find the charger for his laptop, and found instead, open on her screen, a client presentation for Verifeld Solutions that contained on slide 14 a site assessment framework he had written himself 3 years earlier. His framework, his specific language, his variable sequencing, his notation system, the one he had developed over 6 months on the Chillicothe project and refined across 4 subsequent contracts. It was there, in her company's branded template, with her company's logo in the upper right corner, without his name anywhere. He stood in the doorway of the home office for a long time. The house was quiet. Callie was asleep. He could hear the hum of the refrigerator from the kitchen. He did not close the laptop. He did not open it further. He went back to the living room and sat in the chair by the window and watched the street outside for 40 minutes. And at the end of 40 minutes, he got up, went to the bedroom, and looked at his wife sleeping, and understood. with the particular clarity of a man who had built his entire career on not lying to himself about what was in front of him, that she had not made a mistake. This was not an oversight. The presentation was polished. The framework had been formatted, integrated, nested into a sequence of proprietary tools. It had taken work to do that. She had done that work. She had simply assumed he would not see it. He went back to the chair by the window. He did not sleep again that night. He called Harrison Cole on a Monday morning from the parking lot of the firm before he went inside. He had found Cole through a colleague who had dealt with a non-compete dispute 2 years prior. A small referral, passed without drama, that he had stored in the same mental folder he kept everything he might one day need. Cole specialized in intellectual property and professional trade secrets. His office was on the 4th floor of a building in downtown Columbus, with a waiting room that had no magazines and no music, and 2 chairs that were expensive and uncomfortable. This, Marcus had decided, was appropriate. He laid out everything he had on Cole's desk, printed copies of the presentation, annotated with the source dates of each appropriated element, a timeline of the documents he had authored, with timestamps from his firm's internal server. 3 client relationship files he had built over 7 years. The records, the communications, the site histories that now appeared as Verifeld case studies under anonymized names he recognized immediately. A log of 26 specific technical terms, phrases, and procedural sequences that appeared in Verifeld's published materials and existed nowhere in the professional literature before Marcus had coined them. Cole looked at the stack for 4 minutes without speaking. Then, he looked at Marcus. "How long did it take you to compile this?" 9 weeks, Marcus said. Cole nodded slowly. "This is not a borderline case." He said it the way a doctor says a diagnosis, not with satisfaction, not with alarm, but with the specific neutrality of someone who has looked at the evidence and is telling you what it means. Marcus felt something loosen in his chest that he had not realized he had been holding. Cole explained the strategy without theatrics. Trade secret misappropriation under Ohio's Uniform Trade Secrets Act. Potential tortious interference with professional relationships. Civil action against Verifeld Solutions and, potentially, its leadership. They would begin with demand letters to Verifeld's legal team. They would simultaneously file for injunctive relief to prevent further use of the misappropriated materials. The timeline was 12 to 16 weeks before a hearing. Cole would work on contingency against a damages claim he said was, conservatively, in the range of 7 figures. "She doesn't know you've been building this?" Cole asked. "No," Marcus said. "Good. Don't tell her." Marcus had not intended to. The weeks that followed were the strangest of his life. He came home to the same house. He made the same dinners. He picked up Callie on Tuesdays and Thursdays and helped her with the letter-sound worksheets her teachers sent home and read to her from the chapter book on her nightstand before lights out. He filled the thermos every morning. He drove the Tacoma to work. He said goodnight to Danielle and lay in the dark for 30 seconds before the alarm. He told no one at the firm. He did not know yet how far the appropriation had gone, whether any of his current colleagues had been involved, whether the relationship between the 2 companies had roots he had not yet mapped. He needed to understand the full shape of the thing before he made a move. He had learned this on the Chillicothe project, where he had spent the first 3 weeks simply listening and measuring and refusing to form a conclusion. The site had looked straightforward. It was not straightforward. The contamination had migrated underground in a pattern that contradicted the initial survey. He had caught it because he had not trusted the first picture. He did not trust the first picture now. He told his brother Deshaun on a Wednesday night at Deshaun's apartment in Clintonville, where they watched a game on television and he waited until halftime and then said everything in 8 minutes, without stopping, looking at the floor. Deshawn was quiet for a long time. Then he said, in a tone Marcus recognized, the one that preceded action, "Tell me what you need," Marcus told him. He needed someone to hold a second copy of every document. He needed someone who knew the situation if anything happened unexpectedly. He needed someone who was not a lawyer and not at the firm and not connected to Verifeld in any way. Deshawn said yes without discussion. He drove Marcus to a FedEx store that night and watched him print and seal 2 copies of the full documentation file. They kept one at Deshawn's apartment and a lockbox under the desk, alongside the title documents for Deshawn's car. The second copy went back with Marcus to a storage unit he had rented 2 weeks earlier, 3 miles from the house, under his name, paid in cash for 6 months in advance. Deshawn drove back to the apartment in silence and then said, when they were parked outside, "I can't believe she did this." Marcus looked at the windshield. "I can," he said. "I just didn't want to." Danielle did not know that Harrison Cole had already sent a demand letter to Verifeld's legal team. She did not know, because Verifeld's legal team had, upon receiving it, done exactly what Cole had predicted, contained the information at the executive level and begun internal counsel while preparing a response that confirmed receipt and requested 30 days to review. She did not know because no one at Verifeld had told her. She was not, it turned out, the first person they called. This Marcus did not know until later. What he did know was that on the Tuesday morning, 9 weeks into the process, he received a text from Deshawn that said only, "Check your email." He was in the parking lot of the firm. He opened his email on his phone and found a message from Cole's office with an attachment, a preliminary injunction filing, and a notice that the Ohio Attorney General's office had opened a review of Verifeld Solutions' client acquisition practices based on a referral from Cole's office. He sat in the Tacoma for 6 minutes. The morning sun was flat and white on the windshield. He could hear faint traffic from the highway a quarter-mile west. He put the phone in his jacket pocket, got out of the truck, and went to work. What happened over the next 3 weeks moved in 2 directions simultaneously: his building and Danielle's unraveling, neither of which could see the other yet. Verifeld's board had been informed of the legal exposure. They had, without informing Danielle, retained outside counsel and begun a quiet internal audit of the materials in question. The audit confirmed, within a week, that the misappropriation was real and had been ongoing. The board's outside counsel reached out to Cole's office not to dispute the claim, but to discuss the scope of liability and the possibility of a negotiated resolution. Cole called Marcus on a Thursday afternoon. "They're talking," he said. "What does that mean?" Marcus asked. "It means they already know they're exposed. They're trying to understand what it costs them to settle versus what it costs them to fight. At this stage of the review, that's a very good place for us to be." "And Danielle?" There was a pause. "Their counsel hasn't mentioned her, which tells me the board is treating this as an institutional problem, not a personnel one. For now." Marcus processed this. "For now," he repeated. "She's the CEO," Cole said carefully. "The materials originated from her. The timeline starts when she took the role. If this goes to formal litigation, she will not be a bystander." Marcus thanked him and ended the call and sat for a moment in his office with the door closed and the late afternoon light coming through the east-facing window, and thought about his wife's face the night she told him about the CEO offer, and the way she had looked when he held her face in his hands and told her she had earned it. He thought about what earning meant. He thought about Callie's shoebox under the bed, and the notes she could not yet read all the words of, but always opened first. He stood up. He walked to the window. He looked at the parking lot below, and the Tacoma in its usual space, and the highway beyond the tree line. Then he sat back down and returned to the work on his desk. The morning Marcus drove to Verifeld Solutions' offices was not dramatic in the way he had imagined it might be. In the weeks when he had imagined it at all, he had not planned to go. He had an appointment nearby, a site assessment follow-up in the industrial corridor south of downtown, and he had simply turned north at the intersection instead of south, without quite deciding to. He had been doing this more often lately, acting before the decision had fully arrived. The building was on the west side of downtown, 12 stories of glass and poured concrete with a covered entrance and a circular drive and the kind of landscaping that cost money and communicated it. He had been here once before, 18 months ago, for a mutual client meeting that had been arranged before Danielle took the role and had been attended by her predecessor. He had sat in the lobby and looked up at the floor directory and noted, with a feeling he could not name, that the company his wife now ran occupied the top 2 floors. He pulled the Tacoma into the visitor lot and sat for a moment with the engine off. He was wearing a Carhartt jacket over a button-down, field trousers, work boots. He had come from a job site and had not changed. He looked, he understood, like the man who delivers something rather than the man who is expected. This was fine. He had never been the man who was expected. He got out of the truck and walked toward the entrance. He saw it before he was through the door. On the exterior glass panel to the left of the revolving entrance, the kind of panel that held a company directory, building announcements, corporate partnerships, there was a printed notice. He would have passed it without looking, except that his own name was on it, not in reference to him. Not as a citation, as a project name. Verifeld Solutions' proud partner in the Ellison Methodology Compliance Framework, a new standard for regional environmental assessment. The Ellison Methodology. His name on the outside of a building he had never entered as anything other than a visitor. His name attached to a framework he had developed over 6 months on a contaminated site in Chillicothe that 3 previous consultants had walked away from, and that Verifeld Solutions had taken without asking, without attribution, and turned into a branded product bearing his name as if they had found it and named it after him rather than taken it from him. He stood at the glass panel for a long moment. He was not certain what he felt. It was not the anger he had anticipated. It was something older and quieter, the feeling of being recognized after being erased, and finding the recognition obscene because it was accidental. He took out his phone and photographed the panel. Then he walked to his truck, called Harrison Cole, and said, "They named it after me." There was a silence. Then Cole said, "Say that again." Marcus did. Another silence. "Marcus," Cole said, "I need you to send me that photograph right now." He sent it. Cole called back in 4 minutes. They put his name on a publicly branded compliance product and didn't license it. They didn't attribute it. They're using it as a proprietary framework in partnership agreements. This is not just misappropriation anymore. This is commercial exploitation of a professional identity without consent. He paused. Their settlement offer was going to be in the range of $800,000. This changes the calculus. By how much? "I'm going to make some calls," Cole said. "I'll reach you tonight." Marcus sat in the visitor lot of Verifeld Solutions for 11 minutes. The morning was cold, overcast, the particular flat gray of October in Ohio. He watched people walk in and out of the entrance without seeing him. He watched a car pull in beside him and a man in a suit get out and walk inside with the purposeful looseness of someone who had done this 800 times. He thought about the Chillicothe site. the contamination that had migrated in a pattern that contradicted the initial survey. The three consultants who had looked at the first picture and trusted it. He had stayed longer. He had looked at it from every angle. He had not left until he was sure. He had always been thorough. He had always been patient. He had always built things that lasted. He started the Tacoma and pulled out of the lot and drove south to his site assessment appointment, arriving 2 minutes early. The settlement conference took place 6 weeks later on the 24th floor of a building in downtown Columbus. Glass walls, pale birch table, ergonomic chairs that cost more than Marcus's first car. He arrived with Harrison Cole and an associate Cole had brought for documentation. They arrived 5 minutes before the scheduled time and arranged their materials in precise stacks. Cole carried a legal portfolio. The associate carried a labeled binder. Marcus carried nothing except his field notebook, which he placed in front of him and did not open. Verifeld's legal team arrived with 3 attorneys and a board member named Gerald Strand who wore a gray suit and looked at Marcus with the particular attention of someone trying to place a face they had not expected to see in person. Marcus met his eyes and held them and said nothing. The offer came in at $2.4 million, structured as a licensing settlement, attribution rights, and a cease of use of the misappropriated materials. Cole countered. They settled, after 90 minutes of documentation review and 2 brief recesses, at $3.1 million, plus full public attribution of the Ellison methodology, formal removal of Verifeld's proprietary branding around it, and a framework licensing agreement that would pay a royalty on every contract in which the methodology was deployed going forward. Marcus signed where Cole indicated, and did not look across the table when he did. At the end of the meeting, Gerald Strand said, in a voice that carried the careful cadence of a man choosing each word individually, "For what it's worth, Mr. Ellison, the methodology is genuinely exceptional. The team that adapted it spoke very highly of the original work." Marcus capped his pen. He set it on the table. "The team that adapted it," he said, "could have called me." Strand had no response to this. Marcus stood, picked up his field notebook, and followed Cole out of the conference room. Danielle learned the full scope of the settlement on a Tuesday evening from Verifeld's board via a formal notification that arrived 3 days after she had returned from a trip to Pittsburgh she said was client-related. She had not known the settlement was being negotiated. She had not known the terms. She had been kept outside the process by a board that had understood. From the first moment their outside counsel read Cole's demand letter that the exposure belonged to the institution and that involving the CEO would compound rather than resolve it. When they finally told her, $3 million, full attribution, royalty structure, they also told her that her employment as CEO of Verifeld Solutions was being terminated, effective immediately, with a separation package that would require her signature on a non-disparagement agreement. She came home that night and sat at the kitchen table for a long time without speaking. Marcus was in the living room with Callie, reading the chapter book from the nightstand. When Callie was asleep, he came back to the kitchen and made 2 cups of coffee and set one in front of Danielle and sat down across from her. She looked at him for the first time in weeks with something that was not managed. It was just her face, the way it looked when there was nothing left to manage with. "You built this," she said. "Yes." "For how long?" 9 weeks of documentation. Before that, a Sunday afternoon in March. She was quiet. She looked at the coffee cup. "I didn't think you'd look." Marcus set his hands on the table. He looked at them for a moment. 12 years of fieldwork, winter job sites, renovations done himself. He knew these hands the way he knew every site he had ever walked. from every angle, in every condition, down to the thing that was wrong and the thing that would last. "I know," he said. "That was your mistake." He did not say it with cruelty. He said it the way he said things when he was certain. Plainly, without performance. It was simply what was true. She looked at him and started to speak and stopped. He watched her face move through something he recognized, not regret, not quite, but the particular expression of someone who has constructed a version of events inside their mind and is now watching it fail to match what is in front of them. He had seen this on clients who had been told what they wanted to hear by the previous consultant. He had learned to wait through it and not fill it with anything. He picked up his coffee. He stood. "I'll be in the study," he said. He left her at the table. The divorce was filed 4 months later and resolved in 11. The settlement was fair and specific and arrived at without drama, through attorneys who communicated in writing. Marcus received the house, the one he had renovated room by room over 7 years, the original hardwood floors he had hand-sanded, the wraparound porch he had rebuilt from sagging wood, the custom built-ins he had designed for a growing book collection. He received primary custody of Callie, with Danielle having alternating weekends. The financial settlement reflected his professional damages and the assets he had accumulated prior to and during the marriage, documented precisely, in the manner of a man who had always kept exact records of what he built. Danielle moved into an apartment in a building on the north side, a 2-bedroom with a parking garage and a gym she did not use. She found a director-level position at a smaller communications firm 8 months after leaving Verifeld, at a salary that was approximately a third of what she had made as CEO. She was good at the work. She had always been good at the work. She was less good at being alone in the apartment in the evenings, but that was not a thing that appeared in any record or any document. The Ellison methodology, properly attributed, became a standard framework in regional environmental compliance across 4 Midwestern states by the following year. Marcus's firm used it. 7 other firms licensed it through the royalty agreement. He spent a weekend redesigning the documentation to include a complete attribution history, the date, the site, the question it was built to answer. He made it available in the public record. He did not call any journalists. He did not write about it. He simply made it exact and complete and left it where anyone who needed it could find it. He built a cedar Adirondack chair for the back porch. He built it himself, from a design he had sketched on a piece of graph paper one evening after Callie was asleep. He sanded it 3 times. He treated it twice. He set it at the corner of the porch where the morning light came in at the angle he liked, the flat white Ohio light that arrived before it was fully warm and made everything look clear and specific and worth looking at. On the first morning he sat in it, he brought the thermos. The coffee had gone slightly cold. He held it in both hands and looked out at the yard, the raised beds he had built along the south fence, the maple at the far corner whose roots he had worked around when he laid the flagstone path. The flagstone path he had laid himself, measured twice, cut once, secured to last. He did not check his phone. He did not look at the time. He could hear Callie's alarm from her bedroom. In 20 minutes she would be in the kitchen, and he would make eggs, and she would tell him about the dream she'd had, and he would listen to the whole thing without interrupting and put her lunch in her bag with a note in careful block letters in the front pocket. He sat with the cold coffee and the morning light, and the work around him that was his, had always been his, and simply let the quiet be what it was. He did not look back. There was nothing behind him worth looking at. There was the maple tree and the flagstone path, and a small voice beginning to move inside the house, and the day opening in front of him, with all the patience of a man who had built his entire life on not leaving until he was sure. I hope you enjoyed that one. Be sure to like the video and